Welcome to the Shift podcast. This podcast was recorded on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. The creators of this podcast recognize that we are all treaty people and we accept our collective responsibility to each other and to reconciliation as we work towards an equitable, inclusive, and accessible campus for all. On the Shift podcast, facilitated by Student Affairs, you will hear from students of diverse backgrounds about their lived experiences at Queen's, how these experiences are shaped by identity, their visions for a safer and more inclusive campus climate, and what needs to happen for there to be a meaningful and lasting culture shift.
We actively need to engage in educating ourselves and have conversations with people, call people out when you see your friends doing something that
it is just so pivotal how they respond in that first moment, because that totally will influence the way that person goes about their reporting process or healing process in general. So
because amplifying is one thing, but responding and making a solution is the next. I think
things like that I think are huge, and I don't think professors and TAs realize how much influence they have over students in those specific times.
Power dynamics are so important, and they can be so negative, but they can also have such a positive impact.
Today, we'll hear from Aubrey, India, and Alicia. Please note that this episode of the Shift podcast will feature Queen's student experiences and perceptions of campus safety and conversation about topics relating to sexual violence and harassment. Some listeners may find this content upsetting or challenging to listen to. These are difficult topics. If you feel overwhelmed at any point while listening to this podcast or reflecting on it later, pay attention to your needs. There are resources to support you. Visit the Queen's Student Wellness website for more information.
Hi everyone, I'm Aubrey Apps, and I am one of the co-chairs of Consensual Humans. I'm a third year global development student, and really excited to get into a conversation about consent and that sort of thing at Queen's.
Hello, everyone. My name is India Ravenhurst. I am also in third year. I am a history major, and I'm also one of the co-chairs of Consensual Humans here at Queen's.
Awesome. Hi, Aubrey and India, and everyone listening. My name is Alicia Parker. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a second year in life science. And I am one of the gender-based violence awareness and bystander intervention education facilitators at the Student Experience Office.
Awesome. Definitely excited to get into some conversation talking about sexual violence on campus and consent and what that means. I guess a good place to start would be, what do you both think are some of the most prevalent myths about sexual violence on campus?
I think if an individual acts or carries themselves in a certain way, they're asking to be sexually violated or mistreated. I think that's the main takeaway I've taken so far for what the most prevalent myth would be with regards to sexual violence, especially on campus.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure we're going to get into it lots because it comes up a lot in the student experience survey. But I think one of those parts of kind of playing into what people would consider a not perfect victim is that role alcohol can play, which I think is such an important one. And I could pull up the statistic, I'm sure, but it's really astounding how much the levels of sexual assault and sexual violence go up with alcohol in play, and kind of discussing how that impacts the situation, unfortunately.
Yeah, I feel like the main thing I was just going to say was how the sheer quantity of sexual violence that occurs. I think that's sometimes not talked about. So I'm really excited that we're talking about that today, obviously from the student experience survey and how it's disproportionately impacting students. Also, I'm curious as to how you both think that these myths persist.
I think part of it is just a lack of talking about it, especially I think kind of when it comes down to sort of what India brought up about that no perfect victim narrative. It's not just about in the moment, but beyond that, afterwards, on how a victim or survivor acts after the fact, can I think really play into that on how people kind of judge that scenario. They may not act like someone expects them to act, and that's something we talk about a lot in our kind of training. Is that if they didn't fight back or they didn't if they don't seem distraught immediately after, people kind of start to question that, and I think that's really unfortunate and plays into that a little bit of not understanding those myths.
Yeah, like that's so true. I think that like what I think is that the myth definitely continues because of like how stigmatized the topic matter is. Like many victims feel guilt after the event occurs where they were assaulted and try to understand it like through the lens of it was my fault when it wasn't. It's the perpetrators. And I definitely think this can change if people actually place the onus on the perpetrator and don't blame the victim.
That's such a great point. I was at like the Queen's Equity Conference last week, and one of the speakers was kind of like an activist lawyer, and she was talking about how in Canadian law, like prosecutors, I'm not in law, but they're not allowed to ask those questions, but they still will. And I mean, the judge or the other lawyer, it'll get dismissed, but like the jury still heard that, or the victim will get like flustered because people still ask these questions even though like technically they're not allowed. And I think that's such a great point on like how you respond to like a disclosure or like someone talking about their experience is so important. And even just asking those questions could really make someone kind of doubt their own experience, which is so horrible. But I think that's such a great point, Aubrey.
Yeah, and I think also it totally plays into the whole reason that a lot of people choose not to report, because oftentimes in court, I think it's hard for people to come forward and end up reporting because they know that they're going to have to face their character being like completely just torn apart, because oftentimes they will use things like you were too drunk, you were wearing this, were you asking for this, what underwear were you wearing that night, which I just think just makes it even harder for survivors to want to go through that process, because then you're just further faced with like, was this my fault?
And it just like creates a process that instead of being able to report something and go through the process of dealing with something in a way that could be cathartic or help you through it, and it's like it becomes like this daunting task instead of something that's necessary and should be done.
I know in bystander training, we talk a lot about how it's not just the actual experience itself that has like a huge role to play on kind of the journey of the survivor, but also like every time that they like discuss that experience and the responses they receive can have like such a huge impact, positive or negative. So I think that's such a great point, whether it's like a more casual disclosure or whether someone is like reporting something, like how you respond and the questions you ask is so incredibly important.
I watched Unbelievable, that docu-series. It starts off with a young girl and she is sexually assaulted and goes through the reporting process, and it's kind of like a social commentary on just like the reporting process and how that goes. Even consent in like a cop survivor discussion, which I think is just really interesting.
Yeah, I know this is something we talked about at the Supper series as well, but I think that goes into like who has the power in the situation. Because unfortunately, sexual violence like is a lot about power and gender-based violence in general. And unfortunately, it takes the power away from the survivor. And so, if a survivor is kind of recounting their story, like being able to give them that power back and letting them take control of like what they share, when they share, how they share, is so incredibly important. That sounds like a great docu series. I'm gonna have to write it down.
Yeah, and I mean, one interesting thing that I also noticed, when you think about the role of that person who is talking with the survivor at the first instance, is so pivotal, and yet it's so understaffed at Queens, and we have one email given for like roughly 20,000 students at the school. And while that's not the only resource, I think that's the main one that we preach. So I think it is really important that the university sort of invests in more response officers, because it is just so pivotal how they respond in that first moment, because that totally will influence the way that that person goes about their reporting process or healing process in general. So
Also, just having people know that these resources are accessible. I don't think that that's known to a broad amount of students here at Queens, like at all. Like, truthfully, like before I joined this club, I had no idea that of the amount of resources that were available to survivors of sexual violence. And it's unfortunate because it's like I have friends who have been through incidents and they have not been aware that there's someone that they can talk to or someone that they can go through the process with and that can help them. And they've kind of had to go through it alone. And it's like, it's really, really unfortunate because that's something that you need to seek like professional help with. You need to talk to someone who can help you. There's options for you. And I feel like a lot of people don't know that here at Queens.
I think it would be great if there was some way, even coming home last night and talking about the Sunday Supper series to my housemates, they were like, that sounds amazing. but it's so hard to know. Queens and clubs at Queens and students and services are doing so many amazing things, but you have no idea where to look, or there's no like centralized platform to understand like what is available to you. I mean, you hear about stuff all the time and you're like, oh, that's so cool, I would have gone, but I didn't know because I didn't follow that one Instagram page or whatever. So I think it was really great in the last podcast I was hearing that there's the Instagram page that I forget what it's called, but it has like, it basically tells you all the events that are happening with like any queer focused like initiative at Queens, and that's super cool. And I think that that would be like a great initiative for like sexual assault or like consent or the bystander awareness. Like I think that having just a centralized platform to know what all of your options are, and it's like this Friday, this is all the events that are happening in every club that's related to this topic. And I don't know if that does exist because like I feel like you never really know because
Yeah.
there are so many different options.
And I think that's like talking about like a little bit going backwards when you were talking about the consent
Mhm.
Instagram page, like especially with social media, there are so many amazing like pages like Queers at Queens, which is the one you were referring to.
Oh yes, yes.
But also like when you talked about like Stolen by Smith and stuff, and I remember that was the year I came to university, like so that 2020 was like the summer before I started, and like
Mhm.
reading all these things, and it was like, I mean, incredible initiative, and the students that did it, like amazing that they were able to kind of like put like amplify student voices. But it can be really hard, I think, sometimes like on social media we hear about kind of the negatives, and then it's hard to find where we should be going for actual help. And I think that's such a good point, because I don't know, I remember like reading those things where I started university and feeling like really scared about
Yeah.
starting here. And now being like a couple years into my university experience, I have like either friends that I went to high school with, or people I did sports with, or people that are looking at university now, and they like ask me questions about Queens, and they ask about that culture here and whether it's safe and those sort of things. And like the answer I give is not like, it's not a positive one necessarily on a reflection at Queens, which is sad. Like I wish I could say that, like, you know, I always feel safe and I always feel like heard. But that's not always the reflection I give, especially when talking to like marginalized students or equity deserving students. Like that's not their experience a lot of the time. And so I think really kind of directing that, I think there has been a really positive shift kind of in the last couple of years of students' voices being amplified and like hearing more about these experiences. And I wasn't here at Queens before these pages, but from what I hear, there has been like kind of a positive shift there. But I think it's kind of time like to respond, because you know, amplifying is one thing, but responding and making a solution is the next, I think.
It's really great that these pages are being made and that students are being the activists in these situations and creating platforms to amplify voices. But it's like something that I always found so unfortunate about it is that what students have accessible to them to have a platform to, you know, have something to relate to, and the ones that become the most popular are the ones initiated by students, not initiated by adults, not initiated by professionals at the institution where these problems are occurring, where this crisis is happening. And, you know, it's great now that this is happening. And it's, you know, like we're on a podcast right now initiated by an individual who works at Queen's University, which is really great. But it's like in the past, these pages who like got crazy amounts of followers and people could, you know, share their stories with, it's like that was what was available. What I'd like to see in the future is students' voices being amplified through the institution itself and through initiatives being made by the adults, by the professionals.
No, that's such a great point. It does feel like you have to get like thousands of students pressuring sometimes to get one response, where it would be nice to get, you know, something that there wasn't like a huge amount of student labor and equity labor going into it to get kind of a response or action.
Yeah, it's like we were even talking to Megan and Maeve about it at our symposium, or maybe prior, and they were talking about how difficult it was to be the one who was like the first responder to these issues of sexual violence. And like they were talking about how difficult it was to, you know, deal with that. And, you know, they had to take minutes of like mental health breaks because these stories are heavy and they're difficult to, you know, deal with. And, you know, they wanted to do this, they wanted to give a platform, but it's like, you know, that like unbelievably hard. Like that would be hard.
Like looking at the student experience survey, like the number of unfortunately instances of sexual violence and sexual assault on campus, like makes you think like almost every student at Queen's would either experience those like instances themselves, or at least like hear disclosures, or have close friends or peers or classmates or some form of relation. So I think that's really important to kind of think about, like, how not just are we supporting survivors, but how are we supporting the supporters of survivors, because that can be like extremely traumatic and really hard to hear. And you want to remain open, and we talk a lot about like how to respond to disclosures like through the trainings and stuff, but I think it's really important to also just like think about, because they're giving a lot of emotional labor, and it's really important that they're being attentive and understanding and empathetic and giving their time and not appearing distracted, but also like they're students, and this is traumatic for them as well. So I don't know, that's something that I'm really passionate about, because um I think it's something that's not talked about enough, is like how much students take on kind of an emotional capacity of trying to support other students. And I think it kind of comes back to what India said, like making the resources at Queen's more available, maybe, so that it wasn't like students with no professional training that are taking this on instead. But that's just my opinion.
Yeah, or even just like if you see at Queens that there are students who have this interest, like providing them the tools
Yeah.
to like really, other than us joining this out of interest, joining Consensual Humans specifically, there, other than my own like experiences and friends' experiences, like that is my understanding. I've obviously done like a load of just like learning on my own, but I was never given any tools by the university to, further my knowledge, further my ways to support others. So I think that that's like huge, like you were talking about, just being able to support students, whether it's like offering some funding for that time spent, because yeah, it's huge.
And it's such like, I think personally I'm biased, but I think the trainings are really helpful and really great. And I'm sure like we can dive into the symposium later too. Like I'm sure it was phenomenal. But
Mhm.
unfortunately, like the students that are seeking out these things are probably people that are already pretty enthusiastic about creating a consent culture and making a positive
Mhm.
change on campus. So it's a little bit more about like, how do we reach the students that aren't actively seeking out these resources? Because they're probably the ones that actually need the resources, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's something that we've actually talked about, like how can we as individuals who are like trying to like create more consent culture and consent education at Queens reach the people who probably need to be educated on consent education. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like they're not the ones who are actively going to, consent symposiums. They're the ones who need to be like, like one thing that Aubrey and I talked about is it's so interesting that social media is now like a facet that we can like use. And that's why these like big pages like Consent at Queens, the one that Megan and Maeve started, um, is so important because it gets so much viewership. Like so many people are like learning about it. And it's kind of like breaking these boundaries, and it's like creating a space that's not just for the people who are actively educating themselves on consent. It's creating a space for people to just like, oh, I didn't know that that was what consent was. It's not just yes or no. It's not just like the basic fundamentals I learned in high school, grade 9 health class. It's like, it's more than that. It's more of a conversation, which is great.
Something I found as well, just reading through some of the accounts, was that a lot of people wanted to see a resource for unlearning for perpetrators of what like those behaviors are, and like be able to be aware of them.
That's such a great point. I don't know. I feel like collaborations like this are very exciting, because
Hmm.
sometimes, and I've heard this from other students, but like sometimes the circles can get a little small. Like you start to see the same faces a lot, especially kind of when you're doing like equity work or like SVPR work. So I think like finding different ways to kind of integrate into different like clubs or different like groups on campus. And one way I think that's really awesome is when the university administration kind of supports that and allows like these important messages to kind of be shared like in classrooms or like through on cue, or like ways that you can just reach students that are not because of like who they're following or who their friends are. But yeah, so I know you guys mentioned the symposium you held. So what was that like? Did you have panelists? Like how did that go?
Yeah, so we actually had a few guest speakers. We basically, with this event, wanted to bring things back to a fundamental knowledge of what consent means and what it looks like on a university campus, because we feel the transition from a lot of high school students into university through the online period, they've missed that a little bit. So we did have some panelists like Barb Lotan, the sexual violence response officer, who usually is the first responder to any sexual violence incidents that happen on campus or in the Kingston community, or just anytime they have happened in your life and you feel that you want to talk about them now. Then we also had Megan and Maeve, as we discussed before, who were the co-chairs of the 2020 to 2021 school year. And they did the awesome project of the mural on campus, A Love That Clings. And then finally, we had Erica Campbell, who is one of the founding members of Consensual Humans, which was really great to bring it back to understand sort of how it started and what was the motivation there.
Yeah, it was just a really cool opportunity to just like sit down and have a conversation with individuals who have like either worked or continue to work in the field of consent. And like creating a space for conversation and understanding how we can be activists with consent education, especially in campus environments. I think that was like one of the main intentions Aubrey and I had in trying to create this event. And yeah, all the guest speakers were absolutely wonderful. And it was just a really cool way to just sit down and talk and like hear what people have to say about consent. So yeah.
Hi, my name is Barb Lotan. I'm the Sexual Violence Prevention Response Coordinator in the Human Rights and Equity Office at Queen's. There are a number of things that I do on campus, but for today's conversation, I think it's important to know what kind of services our office might be offering students who ask to meet with us. So normally there are two of us in the office, myself and the Sexual Violence Prevention Response Community Outreach and Student Support Worker. That person is largely responsible for education and prevention initiatives on campus. What we're able to do for students is to provide direct support for students who have experienced sexual violence. We do lots of referrals to on and off campus resources, other units on campus like student wellness services, QSAS, student academic supports. There's lots of places we might refer to, the Office of Faith and Spiritual Life. We also provide assistance with accommodations and appeals, so we can write letters of support for academic appeals, help you figure out a path forward, what the implications of, falling behind in academics might be, and come up with some strategies with you to solve those problems. We do some advocacy for you. We help you navigate a number of systems on campus. They're not always all easy to figure out. And we provide information about reporting options. So if you want to make a complaint to the university under the sexual violence policy, if you want to make a complaint to police, we can answer questions about those processes. If you make a university policy complaint, that comes through my office, and then we're available to support you through either of those processes if you're interested in doing that. We provide some support for staff and faculty who may be supporting students as well. So those are the big things in terms of student support. I think what's really important to know is that we don't need to know all of your personal details when you meet with us. We only need to know enough about what's gone on and how it's impacting you in order to help figure out how we might be helpful. We do need to know all the details if we're helping you to write a complaint or we're doing that on your behalf. There's also a high degree of confidentiality in our offices. You don't need to worry that coming to the office will trigger an automatic reporting or investigative process if that's not what you want. We can provide support for a student throughout their entire academic career, so undergraduate, graduate, and you can always bring a friend to a meeting. You don't have to come on your own. You can ask lots of questions. You don't have to make any decisions about next steps that you're not ready to make. You can come back as many times as you need to ask those questions and get clarification. And as your needs change, we can work on new plans and try to be flexible. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me directly at bjl7@queensu.ca. This is a Monday to Friday sort of 9 to 5 service. It's not a crisis response, and so you won't find us after hours or on the weekends. We're also not counselors, so we're not providing therapy. We are systems navigators and support folks. So if it is actually counseling that you need, I really suggest student wellness services, but we can help you connect there too. So don't feel like you're on your own to do all of those things. We're happy to help however we can.
I'm actually really interested in this question, what other topics are important to address as part of this conversation of consent education?
Yeah, I would say a topic that I think is important to address as part of this conversation is at like a very young age learning how to shut down like hate and sexism, and hopefully can nip things in the bud a little bit, with just knowing that you like can say things that are going to shut them down, and that like how important it is to support your friends if that's like someone that you're supporting in that way. I
Yeah.
think that that's like pivotal.
Yeah, I definitely think like to build off that, just like teaching kids from a young age that consent also has a lot to do with power dynamics and
Mhm.
like understanding that like you can be putting someone in an uncomfortable position and maybe not be fully aware because you haven't really opened up the floor to communication. And that can start when you're so young, and it doesn't even have to be with regards to sex itself. It can start off with just interactions with people, making the people around you feel comfortable, because like I feel like so often it's like consent is yes and no, but it's also just like, how can I actively with my partner that I'm about to engage in some sort of relation with make them feel comfy and make them feel like they're able to communicate when they're not.
Just gonna say, I think that's such a great point because I remember, like, I feel like sex ed, at least in my like elementary experience, started in like grade 5 or 6. But I don't remember talking about consent culture because I remember the first time like consent being brought up, like, was when I was in like junior high or something, and like boys making jokes about consent, like in a negative way. And that's the first time that like I heard consent in the context of sex, which is like really unfortunate. And so I don't know, like, why didn't anyone bring it up sooner? Like, why did it have to be like a negative first experience?
Yeah.
Why couldn't it have been positive, I guess?
Actually, a question I have for you, Alicia, something I was thinking about a lot. I don't know if this happened at your high school, but I know at our high school, there was a lot of like nudes being spread, and you would hear it from like your significant other at the time, or like a guy friend if he was in that hockey group chat or whatever, that like a friend of yours had that instance happen. And like, I don't know if you talk about that with like bystander intervention training, what as like a young guy, like more traditionally you do in that situation, like what kind of tools at that age you're given.
No, that's a great point. I don't like, I'm trying to think of like in the training, and I feel bad if I'm missing something. I don't think we specifically address it. One thing I know we address is talking about like consent with all photos. Like even like today, like if you're just like posting a photo on social media, be like, hey, are you good with me posting this? Or like, especially if someone could be like, just double checking always. But I think that's such a great point because I remember that too in high school, and so much victim blaming around that too. So that was like one of my first like introductions to like that culture of like not respecting boundaries, and like an anti-consent
Yeah.
culture like was kind of surrounding like spreading of like photos of people without their consent. And it's such a great
Yeah.
point because what do you do to shut that down, especially when you're like 13 or 14? And I think a lot of that, it comes down to not just like, it should kind of be on the onus of like those guys that are in like those locker room chats and like they're talking and like someone's like, oh, look at this photo, like what do you do to say that? Because like we should be teaching like people like, what do you say to be like, that's not okay,
Yeah.
you need to delete that or something like that. And it's such a great point, and it was never addressed. Like I feel like consent, or not, it was not consent training. Like my sex ed in high school was entirely surrounded like STDs and like and that sort of thing, which also
Same
very
here.
important, but nothing about consent.
The crazy thing when you think about it is like I know most of my consent education was from just being like the youngest of four sisters, just talking about that. And I remember like when I was really young, I was at a resort with my family and drinking like virgin strawberry daiquiris, and I like brought my drink to the bathroom with me, and my mom came back and was like, actually, let's talk, because that was great that you just did that, and like went into it. But you think about like a young man and like not having maybe those conversations, especially with like, I know a lot of my housemates and we talk about consent, or we'll like have a debrief after the symposium, or we'll like hear about an incident and we'll all kind of like sit down and debrief. But you think like traditionally, like a lot of men don't necessarily have those conversations and don't have those like support systems. So I think we just need to really focus on having those conversations in the places that we know that they are for sure going to happen, to make sure that at least like to a certain extent people are getting the gist, because I think it's unfair to rely on all people to just figure that out on their own.
Yeah, Aubrey, like I was thinking, I'm like, man, like the fact that like I know for a fact that me and my girlfriends sit down at the end of the night and have a conversation about situations that may have arisen like with sexual violence, or situations that have occurred, or like we talk about whether or not somebody like made us feel comfortable during sex, or and I feel like with regards to, like, we were talking about this earlier, but with regards to who we want to target with consent education, it's like I don't feel like a lot of men at Queen's University are sitting down and having these conversations like what girls are, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I mean, especially like, I feel like it's predominantly white cis men who are less likely to be experiencing these instances. Like, I do think that we see some male representation, but it is usually men who are more likely to be experiencing these instances. So, yeah, I think it's really, really important. And
And
yeah, I
it's
did.
also just like the fact that they need to like men also have experiences with sexual violence.
Mm-hmm,
And I feel like that's forgotten a lot.
mm-hmm,
And it's like taboo for a guy to like sit down and be like, man, I just like was having sex with someone and I didn't want to. And it's like it happens a lot more often than I
mm-hmm.
feel like it's talked about, because guys have like a different perception of like, or like they have a different stereotype of like how they should be approaching sexual interactions.
Yeah, and even beyond that, like on the conversation of like what like women identifying like individuals talk about versus, and I know I'm generalizing, but like versus what like guys talk about. Like I was talking to my boyfriend who I knew since high school, and I was talking about this friend that we had in common. And I was like, and I stopped hanging out with them and I didn't like them anymore. And I was like, well, they said a transphobic comment. And he goes, well, I didn't know that. Like I would have stopped being friends with them, but I didn't know that. And I was like, well, I don't know. Like we knew them for like a year. Like how did that like, and he's like, but like, when did that come up? And I'm like, it just comes up. Like, if you talk about things, but he was like, that never came up in my conversations. And I'm like, well, I don't know what conversations you're having, but like, I feel like these are things I notice. And I think it's like guys just kind of like gloss over those things sometimes. Like, they don't have those like more difficult conversations.
It's hilarious that you mentioned that, because I have had the exact same conversation with my boyfriend, and it was the exact same thing. It was like a offside comment, and I was there and I was like, let's dive into that for a second, like back it up a few steps. And then I talked about it with him after, and he was like, yeah, I've never noticed that. And I was like, yeah, well, that's weird, because like that's my first time hanging out with him, and I've noticed it just in the first few minutes you're
Right.
talking. Like, and it's so true. Like, I think a lot of the time, the guys just, I don't think, don't really have those like conversations where you're talking about like even just like current events as much, or like what's going on, or like with a lot of the different like girls I've been seeing this week, I've been like, hey, be careful at stages this weekend, or like, hey, there's this guy injecting people at Trinity, like be careful. Whereas I'm not like having those conversations as much with my male friends.
Yeah. But I also think it kind of stands to illuminate, like, because we see the difference, right? Like as women looking at like our male friends.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's kind of important to think that like we're probably not noticing things like microaggressions when it comes to like race, or different like minority groups that we're not part of. And that, I think like sometimes like, it's exasperating looking at the men, but it's probably like I think it's kind of a good way to like evaluate like how we react to other situations and think about like how many things we probably miss and like how much better of a job we could be doing if we were more like just cognizant and really thinking about what people say and like not letting those little things slide, just being like, hey, like, no, and how important that is.
So, guys, how can the Queens community address the discrimination, oppression, and power dynamics that perpetuate rape culture?
Yeah, so I think just to talk about rape culture in and of itself, I think it basically means values and beliefs or behaviors that are normalizing sexual assault and abuse. Um, to me, I think that each faculty is deeply like entrenched with just like behaviors that are normalizing of sexual violence.
For me, it's like coming up with a solution to it. It's just like, you feel like you're kind of banging on this wall. You're like, okay, we need active and requisite education. And we know there's a problem, but nobody's really willing to sit down and address it in a way that actually, creates a change. You know what I mean? It's like there's students obviously who are doing, the activist stuff with like creating Instagram pages and trying to spread like and create a platform, obviously. But I'm talking like the stuff that changes a culture and a community. And it's like, I think this is something that we talked about with our consent on campus symposium, but it's like Queen's University culture is very assumptive.
Yeah. And I think it comes down to like evaluating the history of the institution. Um, Similar to how like it has like deep roots in like a racist past. Like when we talk about like not allowing Black medical students until like a shockingly recent time. But also I remember I work in like orientation, and one of the like when I was applying to be a Gale, one of the questions was like, do you have an idea for like the slogan to go on the back of coveralls? And I was like, I did an online orientation. I don't even know what the slogans on the back of coveralls are. So I was researching it. And like some of the articles that came up were from like the 70s and 80s. And the things that they put on the back of like the coveralls were just like rape jokes. And then like just kind of like diving into like the history of orientation, and that they used to like wear like cards, and you were like women were supposed to say like their weight and their like name, so that like upper year men could like read stats about them, and they would have signs. It's like so horrifying. And so I think that idea of like, oh, like, we're past that, we're just moving on, but like, no, like we need to like actively dismantle these systems, because there is like institutionalized like sexism, racism, misogyny kind of just ingrained in like the Queen's culture. I think that's such a great point, India.
was going to say, I also think that there's like a huge onus to dismantle the rape culture at Queens on like professors and TAs. I think that with instances like the walkout in the fall, I think it was massively important for professors and TAs to make that a thing that students were able to leave class for, whether that means like indirectly just not requiring attendance or not requiring like a quiz that specific period of time in the day. I think speaks volumes to like allowing them to participate in these walkouts, or even just like taking time to really delve into Truth and Reconciliation Day or things like that. I think are huge, and I don't think professors and TAs realize how much influence they have over students in those specific times.
Yeah. And what a positive influence it is when they do. Like, so this isn't my professor, but like I have friends in this course, and so their Professor Goodyear Grant, like during their class was during the walkout, and they walked with the students and attended it with the students, and like, and they were just like, the students felt so like that was a really big moment, and they appreciated that like outward support. And like I think that's like, power dynamics are so important, and they can be so negative, but they can also have such a positive impact. I think that's really awesome. And then the only other thing I want to highlight in talking about kind of the culture at Queens is, I think, and it comes down to like, I'm sure everyone's kind of seen the pyramids. We talk about it in the training as well, but I think sometimes people don't realize like how like insidious the roots of like rape jokes and slut shaming and like victim blaming and like the little like the microaggressions at the bottom, which are still horrible things, but like there's just a lack of understanding that these things build up, and they are the things that contribute to like the things that everyone agrees are like scary and bad, like rape and murder. Like, but it is these like little steps kind of along the way that build up a rape culture, and that like allow these things to happen in society. And when people are like, there's nothing I can do, like that's like, what am I going to do? Like, there are steps you can take to like mitigate those long-term outcomes by stopping those little things along the way that aren't so little, really.
Yeah, like not letting like these type of jokes, not letting this kind of culture slide. I think that's something that's really important, is that we have like a collective responsibility to stand up against rape culture. If like we actively need to engage in educating ourselves, and have conversations with people, call people out when you see your friends doing something that is unacceptable, not just letting these kind of things slide. I think that that's super important.
Yeah, so I guess a good question then from that would be like, where have you both found safe spaces at Queens that you feel are sort of dismantling that culture?
It was definitely this club in second year. I went through an experience personally where I didn't really feel like I knew how to, I looked at this huge system to me was just so messed up. And I'm like, okay, how can I as an individual try to like address this and try to find some sort of outlet to like communicate? And I think that being hired in my second year as a blog contributor for consensual humans allowed me to kind of have an outlet to like write about things that were bugging me, and write about things that, I wish were talked about more. And, I'm really thankful that like consensual humans like was an environment that made me feel like I was able to like write and now like lead, which is so awesome. It feels like super full circle.
I would also agree with you, India. I think Consensual Humans has been definitely a safe space for me. I think my interest in joining the club started just having a close person in my life have an experience at university. and in their frosh week. And I think that that really just like harnessed me wanting to change the environment here. And I noticed it being on West Campus and walking home on those late nights alone when the buses weren't running and just being like, wow, this is should not be allowed. And yeah, me walking in my robe up to the second floor bathroom to take a shower, like that shouldn't be okay. Like just things like that that I think joining Consensual Humans the same time as India as an external relations coordinator was yeah, massive, especially through online, because I think it's hard to find safe spaces through online school, but I definitely think Consensual Humans has been that for me.
Yeah, no, I guess a little bit of a different experience because I'm not in consensual humans. But I think just like the idea of like being involved goes a long way. Like when I like came to Queens, like read and I talked about a little bit like reading about those pages and I came from out of province and so I didn't really know a lot about Queens until I got here and people were talking about this culture. And I was like, I'm so nervous. But I did my first year online. And so I didn't really like I wasn't like running into people on the streets or like in orientation. Like so the people I met were through like initiatives I joined. And so what I joined was student government, like the Arts and Science Undergraduate Society. And I had just like such a positive experience. I was an intern, like all the other interns were like very passionate. Like we started like the initiative we did was we started, it's called queens.u, and it was just a page to help like incoming first years. And it was just such a positive experience. And like the executive team that year, like council, like lovely. And I just like remember being like, this is great, this is awesome. And then in second year, we kind of went back to in person. And it's not that it's been like a negative experience ever since, but it was like when you started going to class and I just like that culture became more apparent. And I really started to like realize, and also like I work at the student experience office, and I still work in the Arts and Science Undergraduate Society. And I just find like the difference between when like the people that get involved in like doing clubs and have like jobs and it's just like a bit of a culture difference like between those and then sometimes when you just like hear things on the street that are really like upsetting or you see things on social media. And so I guess like it's not just like one safe space, but like the students that are committing and doing work are really wonderful people and they're doing so much amazing work. And it's really exciting to be part of those initiatives. Like getting involved for me has been like such a wonderful like space because all those people are working really hard to make a change. But it is kind of a good way, like just joining initiatives like Consensual Humans, or like I got involved in kind of academic advocacy. Like those people that want to make a change are people that are making the change in their own behavior and actions and words as well. So that's kind of what I've done.
Man, this was a wholesome
So
question.
Yeah,
wholesome.
that was a wholesome
But I
question.
think I think even just like safe spaces can be found with like, friends and like people that you trust. And it's like I think that,
Mhm.
apart from, being able to like be a part of a club, it's like if you have a group of people that you trust, like communicate with them, talk to them about things and experiences that you've been through, like and, I think that there are safe spaces at Queens where, you can communicate and go through something and like talk to someone about. And I think that that's really important to know. And it should be way more accessible and advertised. I want us to, be able to like reach so many more people and like have people be aware that there's like resources for them and safe spaces that students are trying to create, because most of the time it's like you find that people who are in these kind of clubs, they have personal experiences and a very deep understanding of the stuff that we're discussing and trying to dismantle.
So, a question that I've been burning to ask the both of you is who or what do you think is the biggest contributor to the culture shift that is so desperately needed at Queens? And who else do you think needs to be a part of the conversation?
I feel like it's the apathetic students a little bit. Like there's always going to be students that are driving hard for advocacy and like that's so awesome to see, but they're always going to be there and they're already doing that amazing work and like they need more. And then unfortunately, I think there's always going to be kind of students that unfortunately just like are not there with the initiatives. But I think there's like literal tens of thousands of students like in between that are just kind of like
Mhm.
apathetic, not really paying attention. And I think those are the ones, unfortunately, like I'd love to say it needs to come from administration, but I think like some of the biggest things we've seen, like Swim by Smith, talking about the consent one, like our win, like all the students get behind it. And so I think those are kind of those students that are on the
Mhm.
fence and not really like listening in often, but when they start to get behind it, like those are the numbers. And I think that's when we start to see the change. So like, you know, you're probably not listening to this podcast. But if you are like, and if like you're seeing like events by like consensual humans, you're like, oh, it's not really my thing, but like good for them. Like show up to an event, like, and like engage in those conversations. And even if you're like, well, I like, you know, like I think I get it, I don't need to talk about it. Like it's still helpful to like have these conversations and like talk about how you can make a positive change at Queens. And so that's what I think where I see like the biggest vessel of change.
That was such a great way of saying it, for sure. Yeah, no, I fully agree with that. I think for me, the biggest contributor definitely is the educators, and not necessarily in like a university setting. I think that if we start our education at the age of 4 years old, and if we were able to just continually be educated on how to have respectful relationships with one another from a young age forward all throughout our lives, I think that that would be
Yeah,
a big change in how we address
Mhm.
consent
that's also
when
great.
we're older, and it would destigmatize a lot.
Yeah.
So
I feel like I'm gonna end up being the kind of pessimistic one here. um, I definitely feel that the university has a huge responsibility in creating this culture shift. I'm mostly saying this because the stats that came out in the student experience survey weren't all that surprising to me, and
Yeah.
I'm sure weren't surprising to a lot of people. And I just, the friend I was talking about earlier, that incident happened more than 10 years ago, and I just think that there is a lot that's happening through students and people who are really passionate about this and driven. But I also think that to make any like really hardcore changes, it really needs to come from the university. That's not to ignore what's going on with students or other things, but I think that there needs to be like a big change at the institutional level.
Well, thank you guys so much for sitting down and having this conversation with me. It was really great hearing both of your
Yeah.
thoughts on all these topics. And yeah, it was great talking to you
Yeah,
guys.
have a
Yeah,
great day.
you
It
as
was lovely to chat.
well.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Shift podcast. To access sexual violence and prevention response services, please visit queensu.ca/sexual violence support. For a list of all the resources mentioned in this episode, please visit the link on the CFRC webpage for the Shift podcast. If you have stories that you'd like to share on the Shift podcast about your experience at Queen's, or have questions or comments in general, email studentexperiencessurvey@queensu.ca. Join us next week for another episode of the Shift podcast.